White cop arrests black woman at Billionaire's Gala, but her true identity shocks everyone. A swirling sea of glittering gowns, the clink of champagne glasses, and the hum of polite laughter fill the majestic ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Outside, the paparazzi clamors for a glimpse of billionaires, A-list celebrities, and political powerhouses arriving at the year's most exclusive charity gala. Yet beneath this polished veneer, tension brews. A single spark will light a fire of injustice, unveiling years of prejudice that have long simmered beneath society's surface. When a black woman, discreet and elegant, finds herself confronted by a racist cop amid the glamour, no one expects the revelation to come, or the cataclysmic consequences that will follow. Glimmering chandeliers hung from the ornately gilded ceiling of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, each crystal facet capturing and reflecting the warm yellow glow of hundreds of lights. Wealth and status radiated from every corner as waiters in impeccably pressed black suits offered canapes and top-shelf champagne to an elite crowd. The chatter of suave financiers, world-renowned artists, and philanthropic icons blended into an orchestral hum of privilege, anticipation, and polite posturing. If one were to step into this glittering scene without context, it would seem as though the world had converged here for a single radiant purpose: to celebrate generosity and unite for a charitable cause. Yet the invisible lines dividing class, race, and status ran deep. Among the swirling silhouettes of bejeweled gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos were unspoken stories, struggles overshadowed by the glamour, lines of tension hidden behind practiced smiles. Tonight's event was, on the surface, a fundraiser for global education initiatives, sponsored by a media mogul whose name was synonymous with success. Anyone with a foot in the halls of power had been invited. The press outside was relentless, capturing every second as billionaire heirs, tech innovators, and philanthropic celebrities made their stately arrivals. Even as cameras flashed, few could see beyond the polished veneer. The hush that existed behind laughter and conversation hinted at truths no one wanted to address. Some whispered about an unexpected guest list addition, a reclusive figure rumored to have gained unprecedented success in biotechnology. There was talk that she was the real reason for the media mogul's extravagance this evening. Those in the know whispered her name, Naomi Henderson. They speculated about her connections, her rumored net worth, and the hush-hush negotiations that might be taking place behind closed doors. Amid the sea of elegantly clad attendees, a watchful presence moved along the perimeter. The dedicated security detail hired by the hotel, supplemented by off-duty police officers, all vigilant, searching for the slightest breach of order. Tall, broad-shouldered, sporting a trimmed moustache, and with an air of hardened cynicism, Officer Gerald Brinkley stood out. Brinkley surveyed the crowd through narrowed eyes, the glint in them suggesting a personal vendetta against something or someone. He had volunteered for this gig, hoping to rub shoulders with the elite, but there was something else lurking beneath his polite facade. For Brinkley, the night was more than a security assignment. The event was an excuse to see how the other side lived, to gather anecdotes about celebrities and power brokers, to boast about them in the locker room back at his station. Yet the arrogance in his gaze hinted at deeper prejudices. Among the swirl of socialites, Brinkley's attention would inevitably be drawn to anyone whose skin color didn't match his narrow expectation of who belonged here. A sense of irony hung in the room. A celebration for global education and equality, teeming with opulence and subtle social hierarchies. Little did anyone know that soon enough these hallways would echo with shouts and accusations, forcing the entire party to confront an ugly truth that had been festering under society's mask of politeness. And at the center of it all would stand a black woman, elegantly dressed, exuding quiet confidence, whose identity would shake the foundations of the event and upend Officer Brinkley's life forever. Outside, a line of limousines, high-end sedans, and even a few sports cars edged slowly forward, depositing their illustrious occupants onto the red carpet. The paparazzi roared whenever a household name stepped out, exploding in rapid-fire camera flashes. Some celebrities paused to pose for them, while others slipped quickly through the glass doors to escape the chaos. Unnoticed by most, a sleek black sedan pulled up to a side entrance, away from the intense spotlight. A driver hopped out and opened the rear passenger door. A pair of slender legs, clad in sparkling high heels, emerged. Then a woman, her dark complexion luminous under the soft lamplight, gracefully set foot on the sidewalk. Her gown, a flowing emerald creation that seemed to ripple like water as she moved, set her apart from the over-the-top flamboyance of the main red carpet arrivals. She had chosen a subtler entrance, perhaps to avoid the barrage of questions she knew would come if her identity were discovered too soon. Her name was Naomi Henderson. In her early 30s, with a figure that combined both athletic grace and poised elegance, she carried herself with quiet confidence. A slight wave in her hair framed her face in a manner that seemed both casual and regal. Tonight's gala was not just another social engagement. It was a mission. Naomi's family roots stretched back generations in Harlem. Raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to support her, Naomi had known adversity from a young age. Yet brilliance in the sciences and a magnetic leadership quality propelled her forward. Scholarships led to an Ivy League education, which in turn led to her founding a biotechnology company that disrupted the field of gene therapy. She had soared to success relatively quietly, choosing not to broadcast her achievements. She despised the tabloid world that seemed to ravage any personal details about black female success stories. Her preference was to let her work speak for itself. Inside the plaza, the hush of the lobby contrasted sharply with the media frenzy at the main entrance. A few staffers recognized her immediately and offered polite smiles, but they knew better than to blow her cover. The media mogul hosting the event had personally invited her, promising a low-profile arrival to facilitate a crucial conversation about a new philanthropic partnership. If all went according to plan, the results would revolutionize educational outreach programs in underserved communities nationwide. Yet despite the warm greeting from some staff, there were eyes on her that dripped with suspicion. Officer Gerald Brinkley, stationed near the front to watch for potential intruders, glanced over and immediately narrowed his gaze. From his vantage point, a lone black woman stepping through a side door at such an event was cause for scrutiny. Perhaps it was the quiet elegance with which she moved, or the confident tilt of her chin. He found it unsettling in ways he couldn't even articulate. To him, this was not someone who belonged. Naomi made her way down the hallway toward the grand ballroom, following the directions given by a discreet event coordinator. As she passed, staff members greeted her in hushed tones, acknowledging her importance. But Officer Brinkley had begun to circle slowly, always keeping her in his peripheral vision. For him, there was a nagging sense that he needed to keep an eye on her. The seeds of confrontation were already planted. Had anyone asked Naomi at that moment, she would have described feeling the slightest prickle at the back of her neck, the telltale sign of being watched. As a black woman who had climbed the ranks of corporate America, she was no stranger to suspicious glances. Often she ignored it. Yet tonight there was a strange tension in the air. She could sense it even before she set foot in the ballroom. And it was a tension that, in only a few hours, would erupt into a scandal that no attendee at the plaza's illustrious gala would ever forget. Officer Gerald Brinkley stood a bit apart from the other security detail, scanning the throngs of arriving guests. He had always been a man who thrived on forming snap judgments. In his early 40s, Brinkley had spent half his life in uniform, from military service in his 20s to joining the police force. On the surface, he prided himself on being a patriot, a staunch believer in law and order. Yet beneath that proud facade lay years of unexamined prejudice, shaped in part by his upbringing in a deeply segregated neighborhood where difference was met with mistrust. Brinkley's father had been a police officer too, a man revered among certain circles for his stern demeanor and zero-tolerance approach, but infamous among the local black community for harassing and demeaning young men of color. Growing up in that household, Brinkley had learned that the badge gave a man power, the authority to draw lines between us and them to maintain the status quo. Whenever Brinkley's father lost his temper, he blamed those people for the city's problems. Brinkley absorbed these sentiments as truths. They shaped his worldview in ways he never bothered to question. When Brinkley himself joined the force, he gravitated toward others who echoed his father's views. Over time, he developed a set of unspoken rules about who deserved respect and who didn't. While on the job, he had faced multiple complaints. In more than one incident, local community members had alleged use of excessive force or racially charged language. Thanks to the blue wall of silence and connections his late father maintained, Brinkley often escaped serious consequences. He grew bolder and his prejudices hardened into an unshakable sense of righteousness. This evening's assignment at the Billionaire's Gala was supposed to be straightforward: stand guard, deter any threats, and enjoy the lavish display of wealth from a vantage point few officers experienced. Brinkley planned to hobnob, gather a few stories for the guys at the precinct, and maybe snag a pricey leftover appetizer or two once the event wound down. Yet, the moment he spotted Naomi Henderson, something primal flared in him. He couldn't articulate it as more than suspicion. Why was she alone? Why was she arriving through a side entrance? Why did she receive such cordial greetings from the staff who seemed to know her? He told himself it was his duty to find answers. But deeper inside, it was a lifetime of racism, shaped by experiences that taught him to distrust a successful black individual who operated outside the lines he recognized. While other guests laughed, greeted each other, and glided into the ballroom without incident, Brinkley began quietly trailing Naomi. The band was tuning up. The hum of conversation in the ballroom had risen to a gentle roar, and no one paid much mind to a single security officer weaving discreetly through the crowd. Still, a pointed look from his fellow guard, a Hispanic officer named Salazar, registered that Brinkley was again focusing on a guest who, to any objective eye, had done nothing wrong. A small voice inside Brinkley hinted that there could be career repercussions if he acted on hunches alone. But arrogance and a lifetime of unchecked bias overruled that voice. Instead, he formulated a plan to confirm his suspicions, certain that his instincts would be validated. After all, in his world, a successful black woman in an event like this was out of place. And if she was out of place, she was a threat. In moments, that dark seed of prejudice would bloom, setting in motion a chain of events that would tarnish not just this glittering evening, but Brinkley's future in ways he never imagined. Inside the grand ballroom, Naomi had managed to slip into the crowd without attracting too much attention. The space was awash with color. Jewel-toned gowns shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, while men in immaculately fitted tuxedos sipped from crystal flutes. The music, a gentle orchestral arrangement played by a live ensemble, offered a soothing counterpoint to the spirited hum of conversation. Staff members glided gracefully among the guests, ensuring the donation boxes were prominently displayed and that the event's philanthropic cause remained front and center. A massive banner hung above the stage, supporting global education initiatives because every child deserves a future. Naomi scanned the crowd, searching for the event's host, media titan Howard Blackwood. He was said to be a charismatic figure, known for turning small-town newspapers into a worldwide media conglomerate that shaped public discourse. Tonight, he was the man of the hour, rumored to be unveiling a major partnership that could transform the face of education in underserved regions, both in the United States and abroad. Naomi had been a key architect behind some of the most revolutionary medical programs in poor communities. She was hoping to join forces with Blackwood's global network to address the root causes of inequality, lack of medical care, educational deficits, and systemic prejudices that stifled advancement. As she reached for a champagne flute from a passing tray, Naomi noticed eyes on her. That alone wasn't surprising. She looked stunning in her emerald gown, and she was used to turning heads at events where she was one of the few women of color. What caught her attention was the undercurrent of tension emanating from a uniformed figure behind one of the marble pillars. She recognized him from her entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same hard stare. Their eyes briefly locked, and she felt an instinctive tightening in her chest. There was no immediate reason for alarm. She had done nothing but show up as an invited guest. Yet the man's scrutiny was unmistakable. Naomi forced herself to relax, thinking that perhaps he was only doing his job as security. Still, the sense of being singled out weighed on her. Though she had no shortage of experience with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, hostilities of discriminatory behavior, the last thing she wanted was an altercation at an event meant for unity. Unbeknownst to Naomi, she was not alone in her awareness. Several guests had begun to pick up on Brinkley's behavior. One was Cynthia Grant, a senior news anchor for CNN. Another was Dr. Paul Whitmore, a university dean and an outspoken advocate for racial justice. They each made mental notes as they watched Brinkley orbit around Naomi, never quite letting her out of his sight. But in a setting where politeness reigned supreme, no one wanted to cause a scene. Not yet. It wouldn't be long, however, before Brinkley's suspicions got the better of him. With each passing moment, his impatience grew. He watched Naomi exchange pleasantries with a few other attendees, gracefully deflecting casual questions about her presence. He watched her pass by the buffet table, selecting only a small amuse-bouche, and when he saw her heading toward a corridor off to the side, likely looking for the powder room or a moment of quiet, he seized his opportunity. In the next moments, the undercurrent of tension that had simmered quietly was about to erupt. Neither the soothing violins nor the refined chatter of millionaires and celebrities would shield the event from the confrontation to come. And for Naomi, who had spent her life navigating countless microaggressions and outright discrimination, the question was not if she would stand up for herself, but how forcefully, knowing the stakes extended far beyond her personal comfort. The corridor leading away from the main ballroom was noticeably quieter, its elaborate wall sconces illuminating the ornate designs in the wallpaper. Naomi welcomed the brief reprieve from the crowd. She intended to find a moment of solitude to gather her thoughts before approaching Howard Blackwood, who was known to be surrounded by eager socialites and financiers vying for his attention. She barely made it past the first set of doors when the echo of footsteps behind her forced her to glance back. There he was, the police officer with the watchful eyes. He moved at a determined pace, closing the distance between them. Instinctively, Naomi's heart rate sped up. She reminded herself she had every right to be here. She squared her shoulders. "Ma'am," Officer Brinkley said, his tone clipped. "May I see your identification, please?" Naomi's brow furrowed. "Is there an issue?" she asked, calmly, but with a firm edge to her voice. Brinkley stared at her, his face devoid of the courtesy he might have offered to someone he considered an esteemed guest. "We received a report of a suspicious individual," he lied, his voice laced with authority. "I need to verify your credentials." A wave of indignation and confusion swept over Naomi. This was the Plaza Hotel, and she was an invited guest at a philanthropic gala. Suspicious individual. The absurdity of it struck her instantly, yet she had encountered enough episodes in her life to understand exactly what was unfolding. A part of her wanted to comply immediately, if only to diffuse the situation, but another part recognized that such compliance perpetuated the assumption that she could be questioned without cause. "I have my invitation," she responded, reaching for the small clutch she carried. "But I'd like to know why you think I'm suspicious." Brinkley's hand hovered near the holster on his belt. "Ma'am, I'm not here to debate. Show me some ID." Naomi exhaled. This was a delicate moment. She could see the arrogance in the officer's eyes, a flicker of hostility she had witnessed in others who believed their badge insulated them from accountability. Despite her anger, she kept her voice measured. "All right," she said, retrieving her driver's license and the invitation card from her clutch. "I'm Naomi Henderson. I'm here as a guest of Mr. Howard Blackwood." Brinkley barely glanced at the license, focusing instead on the name on the invitation. "Got a business card or something else?" His condescending tone hardened Naomi's gaze. She pulled out a gold-embossed business card bearing the name of her biotech company, Epigenica Innovations. Brinkley lifted an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Never heard of it," he muttered. "That's surprising," Naomi said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "We've been in major news outlets, including CNN and the New York Times, for our breakthroughs in gene therapy." Brinkley, however, didn't look like he cared. His mind was set. "I think it'd be best if you come with me to verify all this," he said, sliding the license into his pocket. "We can't be too careful with gatecrashers these days." Fury flared in Naomi's chest. "I'm not going anywhere with you, officer. I have the credentials to be here. Kindly return my license, and I'll be on my way." Brinkley stiffened. His hand rose to his shoulder radio. "We can do this easy, or we can do it the hard way," he threatened, voice dripping with menace. "Don't make a scene." Naomi's patience snapped. "You're the one creating a scene," she retorted, feeling her muscles tense. "I've shown you everything you asked for. I have every right to be at this event." At her challenge, Brinkley's lip curled. Without warning, he grabbed her wrist. Naomi gasped, and, in an instinctive move to protect herself, tried to wrench her arm free. That was all Brinkley needed. He twisted her arm behind her back and pressed her to the wall, ignoring her cries of protest. In one swift motion, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto her wrists. The metallic click was shocking, an abrupt intrusion on the hush of the corridor. Naomi felt humiliation and outrage crash over her in equal measure. Within seconds, others, guests, staff, and security personnel poured into the corridor, drawn by the noise. The expression on every face ranged from alarm to confusion. "What on earth is going on here?" demanded a woman wearing a journalist's badge, Cynthia Grant from CNN. Her eyes swept from the officer to Naomi, cuffed and pressed against the wallpaper. Brinkley announced loudly, "I'm detaining a trespasser who refused to comply with security protocols." Naomi caught her breath, anger sparking in her eyes. "I showed him my ID. He's harassing me because I'm black," she managed to say, her voice trembling with both fury and the sting of injustice. A stunned hush fell over the small crowd. In that single electrifying moment, the perfect veneer of the plaza's gala shattered. On the cusp of the glitzy event, a raw and very public act of racism was unfolding. Cameras were being pulled from pockets. Smartphones were raised. This was not going to be swept under the rug. Without hesitation, Cynthia Grant turned to her cameraman, who had rushed over at her signal. "Get this on record," she muttered, pressing a microphone into his hand. Dr. Paul Whitmore, who was nearby, demanded that Brinkley release Naomi immediately, but Brinkley doubled down. "I'm calling for backup," Brinkley declared, his voice betraying a trace of panic that warred with his bravado. "She's resisting arrest." The scene had escalated far beyond the initial suspicion, and as tensions rose, a tremor rippled through the entire event. In the coming minutes, the grand ballroom would erupt with shocked gasps, heated arguments, and an explosion of camera flashes. For Naomi, a single horrifying thought looped through her mind. "He's doing this just because of my skin color, and he thinks he can get away with it." Little did Brinkley or anyone else know, the biggest bombshell was yet to come. Because Naomi Henderson was no ordinary guest. She was a woman whose identity and connections would cause a seismic jolt, one that would reverberate through the city's power circles and bring down a brutal hammer of accountability on those who so brazenly harmed her. Pandemonium. Shouts ricocheted off the marble walls as more guests and onlookers crowded into the corridor. A few tried to intervene, but Brinkley barked at them to keep their distance. Cynthia Grant's camera was rolling, capturing every tense second. Hotel staff urgently radioed upper management, demanding immediate assistance. Yet in the face of it all, Naomi stood with her arms locked painfully behind her. Her cheeks burned, not merely from pain, but from the indignity of being treated like a criminal in an event dedicated to equal opportunity. Amid the chaos, a commanding voice broke through. "What is going on here?" Heads turned to see Howard Blackwood himself, the evening's host, striding forward with measured urgency. His tailored midnight blue tuxedo and signature silver hair shimmered under the corridor's lights. By his side was none other than Erica Goodwin, the hotel's esteemed head of public relations, who wore a look of horror at the unfolding spectacle. Officer Brinkley glared, but his confidence wavered at the sight of the media giant. "Sir," he began, in a tone meant to convey authority, "we have a trespasser here, someone who refused to follow instructions." He emphasized the last words as though she had posed a mortal threat. "I'm merely doing my duty." Howard's eyes darted between Brinkley and Naomi, taking in her handcuffed state and the accusation swirling in the air. Then something in his expression shifted. Recognition. He had never met Naomi in person, but he had seen her photograph in the briefing materials for tonight's agenda. A hush fell as he locked eyes with Brinkley. "Trespasser," Howard repeated, his voice full of quiet, incredulous rage. "This is the woman I invited, Naomi Henderson, founder and CEO of Epigenica Innovations. She's not a trespasser, she's our guest of honor." The corridor seemed to freeze in time. Gasps escaped from those who had remained silent witnesses. Even Cynthia Grant's professional facade faltered, replaced by shock. Brinkley's eyes went wide, the color draining from his face. For the first time that night, he seemed to grasp the magnitude of his actions. He'd put handcuffs on a woman who was not only innocent, but someone with direct ties to the man who owned half the media outlets in this room. I had no idea," Brinkley stammered, his grip slackening on Naomi's arm. He made no move yet to remove the cuffs, as if paralyzed by shock and fear. Howard advanced, each step more menacing than the last. His entire aura radiated fury that he struggled to contain. "Uncuff her immediately," he commanded, his voice low but resolute. "Now." Realizing the precarious situation he was in, Brinkley fumbled for his keys and released Naomi's wrists. The clatter of the cuffs hitting the tile floor felt like an unmasking, a definitive condemnation of the prejudices that had sparked this entire crisis. Naomi rubbed her wrists, her eyes damp with rage and humiliation. Several onlookers, including Cynthia Grant and Dr. Whitmore, rushed forward to comfort her. Howard turned to Naomi, his expression filled with regret. "Ms. Henderson, I'm deeply sorry this has happened under my roof." His voice shook slightly, belying the calm he was trying to project. Officer Brinkley opened his mouth to speak, probably to offer some justification, but Howard fixed him with a steely glare. "You," he said, each syllable cutting through the hush like a knife, "have made a catastrophic error. You've not only harmed Ms. Henderson, but you've tarnished the values this entire event stands for." For a moment, Brinkley stood there stunned, face flushed with regret and fear. Every camera in the corridor was pointed at him, capturing the raw reality of a racially charged harassment incident within one of the most luxurious and public settings in New York City. In those few seconds, the gravity of his choice crushed him. No carefully spun police statement could undo what so many had witnessed, recorded, and shared. Social media had likely exploded the moment the cameras started rolling. Naomi's voice trembled as she finally spoke, turning towards Brinkley. "You did this because of my color. I showed you my ID, my invitation. I cooperated, but in your mind, I was out of place. I was a threat." She turned away from him, unable to look at the man who had just assaulted her without cause. The pain in her wrists was overshadowed by a deeper pain, one that came from a lifetime of being seen as other. Yet, in the swirl of her turmoil, something else began to crystallize. Truth was on her side, and now the entire world would see it. Howard gestured for medical staff to check on Naomi. Quietly, the corridor began to empty as some of the staff and curious guests shuffled back, uncertain if the evening's festivities were even continuing. Among those who remained were the news crews, Dr. Whitmore, Cynthia Grant, a few philanthropic supporters, and a thoroughly deflated Brinkley. Cameras continued rolling, capturing the final moments of the confrontation. Finally, Howard addressed the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed a grave injustice. I promise you, this matter will be addressed to the fullest extent. The values we uphold, the values this fundraiser stands for, are not mere words on a banner. Ms. Henderson is a pioneer in gene therapy, a generous philanthropist, and an honored guest at this gala. Nothing and no one can take that away from her." As if on cue, a thunderous hush enveloped the corridor. In that lull, Brinkley seemed to shrink in stature, trapped in the inexorable public spotlight. He might have been pondering how quickly his world had changed. Just moments earlier, he'd felt invincible, convinced his authority would protect him. Now the world's harsh scrutiny threatened to devour him. For Naomi, however, this was more than vindication. It was a horrifying glimpse of how easily success, brilliance, and even a personal invitation from a media mogul could crumble before the unstoppable force of ingrained racism. The confrontation might have ended, but the scars would linger. The real question was, what came next? Could a system built on power imbalances be made to account for its injustices? Would Brinkley face the kind of repercussions that might set an example for others? One thing was certain: the entire trajectory of the evening had shifted. The arrest of Naomi Henderson would ripple far beyond the ballroom's gilded walls, igniting discussions, accusations, and a fervent demand for change that no one would be able to ignore. As paramedics gingerly inspected her wrists, Naomi's mind drifted in a swirl of memories. The raw sting of humiliation and fear gave way to recollections of her life's path, a turbulent journey paved with countless instances of microaggressions and outright discrimination. She remembered the earliest days in her grandmother's small Harlem apartment, a place teeming with love, even when finances ran thin. From an early age, she was encouraged to read voraciously. Her mother, working as a hospital orderly by day and taking on housekeeping gigs by night, never let Naomi's curiosity go unfulfilled. She brought home worn-out library books and second-hand encyclopedias, fueling Naomi's inquisitive mind. She also instilled in her daughter a steely determination not to let societal expectations or bigotry define her. Naomi's intellect blossomed. By the time she was in high school, she was entering and winning state science fairs. Teachers, initially skeptical, realized they had encountered a prodigy. She was soon scouted by top universities. There were scholarships galore. Nevertheless, even with her accomplishments, she often found herself singled out, her every success questioned with a subtle, "Are you sure you can handle this?" or "You must have had help from somewhere." At Columbia University, she majored in molecular biology. It was there that she first encountered overt racism from a professor who doubted the quality of her research. Naomi persevered, channeling her anger into ambition. She graduated at the top of her class and secured a spot in a prestigious graduate program, eventually founding Epigenetica Innovations. She wanted to bring cutting-edge gene therapy to the masses, not just to the wealthy. Investors were wary. Few believed a young black woman could helm such a complex startup, but she found allies who recognized her genius, and soon Epigenetica Innovations made breakthroughs that landed the company on the front pages of scientific journals and major newspapers. Yet for all her success, Naomi remained acutely aware of the precariousness of her position. She often joked with her closest friends about how her everyday existence straddled two worlds, the glittering heights of biotech success and the bitter truths of systemic inequality. Her invitation to Howard Blackwood's event was a culmination of years of forging alliances with philanthropic organizations. Together, they planned to create a blueprint for integrated solutions, combining education, healthcare, and socio-economic development to uproot systemic injustices from the ground up. Now, that meticulously built facade of acceptance had been ripped away by a single officer's prejudice. As Naomi looked up at the corridor's ornate ceiling, her wrists still throbbing, it felt like a punch to the gut. It reminded her that no matter how far she came, how many accolades she earned, there would always be those who saw her as out of place. But it also renewed her conviction. She would not be silent. Slowly, Naomi refocused on the present moment. She overheard the paramedics telling her that no bones were broken, only mild bruising. Howard Blackwood stood nearby, still in conversation with several high-profile guests and staff. They were trying to figure out how to proceed with the gala in the wake of the scandal. Brinkley was nowhere to be seen, presumably taken aside by hotel security or the police force's internal affairs representative. Naomi inhaled deeply, wiping away the tears that had pooled at the corners of her eyes. She wasn't going to let tonight's incident overshadow the broader mission. She had come here to secure partnerships for global educational initiatives, and she intended to do just that. If anything, this incident underscored the urgent necessity for change. Change she intended to spearhead. Steeling herself, Naomi placed a hand on a paramedic's shoulder and nodded her thanks. Then she began walking toward the main ballroom once more, aware that every eye in the corridor was on her. Some gazed with pity, others with admiration for her courage. But in Naomi's mind, the only objective that mattered was seizing this moment to push her philanthropic goals forward and expose the deep-seated biases that threatened to derail genuine progress. Tonight, her story would not be one of victimhood. It would be one of transformation. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom had changed dramatically. Just minutes earlier, it was all glitter and high spirits. Now an undercurrent of shock and uncertainty permeated. Conversations hushed whenever Naomi's name was mentioned, and many wondered whether the event should be called off altogether. Yet Howard Blackwood stood at the center of it all, calmly insisting that the fundraiser continue, albeit with a more serious tone. He believed the cause they were supporting was too important to be overshadowed by one bigoted act. Simultaneously, he was on a warpath, determined to ensure that accountability was served. Multiple news crews were hastily setting up or adjusting their cameras, their anchors practicing live stand-ups. The story had escalated to national attention within minutes, propelled by social media posts from guests who had recorded the incident on their phones. Hashtags like Naomi Henderson, Stop Racism, and Plaza Incident trended worldwide. Cynthia Grant, her voice measured but laced with urgency, was among the first to go live from the scene. Her coverage seamlessly intertwined interviews with key witnesses, commentary on the broader social implications, and the undeniable presence of a courageous black woman who had been mistreated in a place that symbolized prestige and charity. She used the coverage to highlight not just Naomi's accomplishments, but the persistent racism that existed even in the most civilized settings. Behind the scenes, Howard Blackwood's PR team scrambled. They released immediate statements condemning the officer's actions, praising Naomi's resilience, and affirming the event's commitment to equality. Meanwhile, the top brass at the NYPD was already under pressure. Video evidence left no room for ambiguous statements or deflection. The question was not if Brinkley would face consequences, but how severe they would be. Naomi, for her part, had stepped away to a private alcove for a short reprieve. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support from friends, business colleagues, even strangers who had caught wind of the incident. She skimmed through them, touched by the outpouring of solidarity. Yet she also noticed the hateful remarks from anonymous trolls. Some insisted she must have provoked the officer, while others dismissed the incident, claiming she was playing a race card. The vitriol was a painful reminder that for every ally, 1,000 illusions of bigotry thrived in the shadows. Despite the emotional toll, Naomi knew this was no time to hide. She drew a breath, tapped out a tweet acknowledging the incident, and thanked everyone for their concern. She ended with a promise. We must continue pushing for systemic change. This is why we stand together. This is why we fight. With that, She emerged into the main ballroom again. A hush fell almost immediately. Cameras panned to her, reporters pressed forward, and guests parted like the Red Sea. Naomi's gaze was clear, resolute. She stepped onto the small stage where a microphone awaited, courtesy of Howard Blackwood. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing in the vast space, "I came here tonight because I believe in the power of unity, collaboration, and opportunity. I stand before you humbled by the support I've received, but also outraged that in 2025 we still face acts of blatant racism and even physical assault because of the color of our skin." A wave of murmurs swept across the crowd, many nodding in agreement. Others looked down, perhaps ashamed of their own complicity or blind spots. "This cause we're gathered for," Naomi continued, "is about global education, ensuring every child has a future. But how can we talk about educating children if we aren't willing to confront the prejudices poisoning our own backyards, if we allow the structures that perpetuate injustice to remain unchallenged?" At that moment, the crowd seemed fully invested. Even the wealthiest, most privileged among them recognized the weight of her words. "I want to thank Mr. Blackwood for inviting me tonight," she said, directing her gaze to Howard. "Our work is only beginning, and I still believe that bridging gaps in education can transform societies. But let me be clear, we need more than donations. We need structural change. We need accountability for those who abuse their power. And we need to stand up, collectively, against all forms of hatred and bigotry." A scattered round of applause turned into a standing ovation. Cameras flashed. Cynics in the room might have dismissed it as performance, but the energy was palpable. Naomi, though shaken, harnessed her pain to drive home a powerful message. It was a speech that would be replayed on every major network by dawn and become a viral sensation on social media before midnight. As she stepped down from the stage, the applause lingered. Howard Blackwood clasped her hand, offering a silent pledge of solidarity. Others crowded around, expressing regret, sympathy, or newfound resolve. And in that charged atmosphere, one thing was clear. Tonight would be remembered less for the philanthropic fashion statements and more for the profound moment when a courageous black woman challenged a broken system and found herself holding a spotlight that illuminated truths too big to ignore. In a nondescript side hallway, far from the main ballroom's dramatic spotlight, Officer Gerald Brinkley paced relentlessly. Gone was the swaggering confidence he had displayed earlier. His face had turned an ashen grey, his posture bent under the weight of looming consequences. Two of his precinct colleagues stood nearby, their body language revealing unease. They had been called in by hotel security, uncertain about whether to escort Brinkley out or wait for official NYPD directives. Brinkley's phone buzzed with calls and messages. Fellow officers, family members, even casual acquaintances inundated him. Some offered misguided words of encouragement, "We'll get through this, buddy," while others warned that he was on his own now. Rumors swirled that the police commissioner was personally looking into the matter and that an internal investigation was inevitable. In the social media sphere, calls for Brinkley's immediate termination had gathered tens of thousands of signatures within hours. Finally, a senior officer, Lieutenant Camilla Harding, arrived, her expression steeled. She approached Brinkley with measured steps. "You have any idea what a mess this is?" she asked, her voice neither loud nor soft, but carrying an unmistakable gravity. Brinkley ground his jaw. "I was following protocol," he muttered, though he sounded unconvinced. Harding narrowed her eyes. "Protocol? You had no legitimate grounds to detain her, and we have half a dozen phone-recorded videos that show you ignoring her valid credentials. Not to mention your use of force appears completely unprovoked." Brinkley's voice rose defensively. "She refused to comply at first. She made me suspicious. I was just doing my job, ensuring the safety of the guests." Harding let out a dry laugh. "Ensure the safety of guests by arresting the guest of honor?" She shook her head. "You had no reason to doubt her credentials except your hunch. That won't hold up under scrutiny, especially with evidence that you singled her out." His cheeks flushed, and he tried to muster a rebuttal. "Look, you know how it can be. People sneaking in, threats in these big events." "Stop." Harding's voice became firm. "You and I both know the press is all over this. The fact that Missy Henderson is black, and you forcibly handcuffed her after she showed ID, it's indefensible." He mumbled something inaudible, but the gist was clear. His father's legacy, his sense of entitlement, the bubble of impunity he had operated in, it was all unraveling. "Hand over your badge and gun," Harding ordered, extending her palm. For a moment, Brinkley froze, a glimmer of rebellion in his eyes. Yet he saw no choice. Gritting his teeth, he unhooked his badge from his belt and handed it over, then followed with his firearm. Harding's expression was distant, but not unkind. "You're suspended pending an internal investigation." One of Brinkley's colleagues stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder in a half-hearted show of support. But Brinkley shrugged it off, feeling both cornered and furious. In his mind he replayed the confrontation in the corridor, searching for some way to absolve himself. Perhaps he convinced himself that Naomi's manner had been too confident, her gown too expensive, her presence too improbable. These twisted rationalizations offered fleeting solace, but as each second passed, a deeper truth pressed in on him. He had done this, and there was no easy way out. "You've dug yourself a grave," Harding said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I'd advise you to lawyer up." With that, Brinkley was escorted from the plaza by his own colleagues. He left through a rear exit, avoiding the waiting throng of media outside. Yet the damage was irreversible. The cameras had already captured his face. Social media had already dissected every angle. That single moment of unchecked racism, a moment repeated countless times across the country, but seldom so publicly exposed, had become a lightning rod for outrage, and the reverberations would hit him harder than he ever imagined. Despite the whirlwind of events, Naomi continued to push forward with her mission. She worked alongside Howard Blackwood's team to finalize the details of their philanthropic partnership, ensuring that the funds raised at the gala were allocated efficiently to community-based education programs. In a newly organized press conference, she stood at the same lectern where she had once delivered presentations on gene therapy. This time, her message went far beyond medical breakthroughs. Dressed in a simple black suit, Naomi spoke to a global audience, courtesy of a live broadcast facilitated by Blackwood's media empire. "I want to stress that our fight isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her voice steady. "My experience shines a light on a system that allows, and sometimes even enables, these abuses of power to happen every day to people without the resources or the platform to fight back." She paused, glancing at a set of photographs arrayed on a stand nearby, pictures of individuals who had filed similar complaints against Brinkley, pictures of families who had lost loved ones in police encounters. "These are the faces of those who have suffered in silence. Today, I speak for them as well. We won't accept anything less than comprehensive reform." The speech was raw yet poised. Naomi balanced her demands for accountability with a plea for unity. "We are not calling for chaos or an end to law enforcement. We are calling for a just system, one that treats every person with dignity." Officer Brinkley's actions were a symptom of a much larger disease, and like any disease, it needs a cure rooted in systemic change. Applause erupted from the audience. Many viewers watching from home wiped away tears, struck by the sincerity and gravity of her words. Naomi's speech resonated across the social and political spectrum. A movement coalesced around her, a coalition of civil rights advocates, philanthropists, educators, and community organizers banded together under a new hashtag, Beyond This Moment. In the days following her speech, donations to grassroots racial justice organizations soared. Volunteers poured into police reform initiatives, legal defense funds, and educational empowerment programs. Naomi met with congressional representatives and city council members, presenting policy proposals that included mandatory bias training and community review boards for police departments nationwide. She also emphasized the importance of redirecting funds towards education, healthcare, and social services, arguing that a more equitable society naturally leads to safer communities. Through it all, Naomi juggled her responsibilities as CEO of Epigenica Innovations, ensuring that life-saving research continued apace. Colleagues marveled at her ability to shoulder so many burdens. At night, she often collapsed into bed, physically and emotionally drained. Still, she found solace in the belief that something transformative was unfolding. If her ordeal could spark a dialogue that reached the highest corridors of power, perhaps it was worth the personal toll. Meanwhile, Howard Blackwood demonstrated unwavering support. He used his vast media resources to highlight positive stories of police-community collaboration and to hold law enforcement officials accountable. In an op-ed published in the New York Times, he wrote, "Naomi Henderson's story proves that no amount of success can insulate a Black American from prejudice. It's time we stop treating these incidents as isolated or extraordinary. They are not. We must demand better from the institutions sworn to protect us." For Naomi, the synergy with Blackwood's network was more than just good PR. It was a chance to elevate marginalized voices to a global platform. As she continued to speak out, she kept her grandmother's words close to her heart. "Baby, if you've got a voice, use it for those who don't." And so, with every press conference, every legislative proposal, and every philanthropic grant she authorized, Naomi fought to ensure that the unity and resolve born from her personal pain would spread far beyond a single gala in New York City. The incident at the Plaza Hotel had become a catalyst for deeper societal questioning, and, if the swelling grassroots momentum was any indication, it might just prove to be a turning point. 7 months after that fateful gala, the public's attention converged on the courthouse steps in downtown Manhattan. Protesters gathered, signs held high, chanting slogans demanding justice. The day had come for the first major court hearing addressing Naomi's civil lawsuit and the criminal charges levied against Gerald Brinkley. The courthouse facade, a colossal structure of grey stone pillars, was swarmed by reporters. The quiet decorum inside contrasted sharply with the fervor outside. Naomi arrived accompanied by her legal team, walking past lines of supporters who cheered and applauded. She wore a dignified grey dress, her hair pulled back in a low bun, her face resolute but tense. Each step reverberated with the gravity of what was at stake, not just a personal victory, but a broader vindication for those who had faced similar injustices. Brinkley entered from a different entrance, flanked by his defense attorney. Gone was the uniform he once wore with pride, replaced by a cheap navy suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. He looked exhausted, weighed down by the legal battle that had cost him nearly everything: his career, his reputation, and his circle of allies. Inside the courtroom, the presiding judge, an imposing figure known for her no-nonsense approach, addressed the standing-room-only crowd. Rows of activists, journalists, and members of the public crowded the benches, eager to witness the next chapter of this high-profile case. The prosecution presented evidence of Brinkley's history of complaints, each meticulously documented, each painting a pattern of racial bias and excessive force. Several individuals who had previously filed cases against Brinkley testified about their experiences, adding weight to the argument that Naomi's arrest was far from an isolated lapse in judgment. Naomi took the stand, recounting the night of the gala with a calm, methodical clarity. Her voice cracked only once. When describing the moment, Brinkley pinned her against the wall. She admitted the incident left her feeling helpless, humiliated, and enraged, but also more determined than ever to demand accountability. When Brinkley's attorney cross-examined her, attempting to insinuate that Naomi had been uncooperative, the courtroom buzzed with disapproval. Naomi remained steadfast, emphasizing how she had provided her ID and invitation from Howard Blackwood himself. The cross-examination inadvertently drew attention to the existence of multiple video recordings that contradicted Brinkley's earlier claims. In his own testimony, Brinkley struggled to muster an apology. He offered a heavily qualified statement, suggesting he'd been on high alert and had misread Naomi's intentions. His voice trembled, revealing fear and remorse, but never did he fully own up to the racial dimension of his actions. The prosecution capitalized on this reluctance, framing Brinkley's stance as emblematic of a deep-seated bias. Throughout the hearing, the judge's demeanor remained impartial yet stern. The arguments were compelling, the evidence formidable. By day's end, Brinkley's defense team appeared drained, having failed to poke any significant holes in Naomi's account or the broader pattern of his misconduct. The judge concluded the session by stating she would need time to review all the evidence thoroughly. Court adjourned with a warning to both sides to prepare for a final ruling soon. As Naomi exited the courthouse, she was met by a wave of cheers and spirited chants from the gathered crowd. She stood briefly before the cameras, thanking her supporters and reiterating the case wasn't just about her. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure the indignity and violence I faced. Brinkley slipped out a side door. Reporters tried to follow, but he managed to evade them. A lone photograph captured him from a distance, a dejected figure dwarfed by the courthouse columns, hands shoved into his pockets, gaze fixed on the ground. It would become an iconic image symbolizing the downfall of an officer who had wielded his badge without conscience. In the days following the hearing, political leaders voiced optimism that the outcome could spark a seismic shift in police accountability. Naomi continued her work, simultaneously pressing for legislative reform and expanding epigenetica innovations to partner with community health clinics. The synergy was obvious. Better health care, better education, and a justice system held accountable would collectively forge stronger, more equitable communities. And so the world waited for the judge's final ruling, hearts pounding with anticipation. Would Brinkley face true consequences? Would Naomi's courage create a ripple effect for change, or would the system find a way to mitigate its responsibility once again? The tension was palpable, a collective holding of breath. Because in this moment, justice felt like more than a legal decree. It felt like a moral imperative, long overdue. In the run-up to the final ruling, an unexpected development took the already dramatic saga to new heights. While working late at her office one evening, Naomi received a call from Cynthia Grant, the CNN anchor, who had been covering her story since the Gala incident. Cynthia's voice crackled with urgency over the line. "Naomi, you're not going to believe this," she said, barely pausing for breath. "We've uncovered some bombshell information about Officer Brinkley." Naomi's hand tightened around the phone. For months, Brinkley's name had been seared into her consciousness as the man who tried to humiliate her and nearly destroyed his own career in the process. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear more about him. Her energy was better spent focusing on the lawsuit and her philanthropic initiatives. But Cynthia insisted. "We found old letters in a family archive," Cynthia continued. "It turns out Brinkley's great-grandfather was a noted civil rights attorney, a black attorney, who passed as white after facing relentless discrimination in the early 1900s. For a moment, Naomi was certain she had misheard. "Say that again." "His name was Benjamin Brinkley," Cynthia explained, her tone subdued, clearly aware of the gravity. "According to census records and personal letters, he was a mixed-race man who married a black woman, but at some point he made the decision to pass as white for personal safety and economic opportunities. Over the generations, the family either suppressed or entirely forgot this part of their lineage. We have evidence that suggests Gerald Brinkley himself had no idea." Naomi's mind reeled. If true, it meant Brinkley had been harassing and assaulting black people while himself descending from African-American ancestry. She didn't know whether to feel rage, sorrow, or a twisted sense of irony. The revelation added a tragic layer to an already fraught narrative. It reminded her how deeply entrenched racism could be, even when one's own heritage contradicted the hatred they espoused. Cynthia's team verified the documents with genealogists and historians. Within days, major news networks ran headlines like, "Officer charged in racist arrest may have black ancestors." Talk shows debated the complex psychological implications of internalized racism and ancestral erasure. Some commentators mused that this might force Brinkley to confront a part of himself he had vehemently rejected. Naomi found herself at the center of another media storm, asked for her opinion on the shocking revelation. She chose her words carefully. "I hope this information prompts Officer Brinkley to reflect deeply on the history and humanity he shares with the very people he's harmed. Knowing you have black ancestry shouldn't matter for treating people with basic decency, but perhaps it could be a catalyst for his own transformation." Behind the scenes, Brinkley reportedly spiraled into emotional turmoil. Anonymous sources close to him said he shut himself off, refusing interviews and avoiding family gatherings. The humiliating irony weighed heavily on him. For years, he had upheld the toxic prejudices inherited from his father, while never understanding that his own bloodline included people he had vilified. In a desperate bid to refute the evidence, he hired private investigators, but they only confirmed the genealogical findings. Meanwhile, Naomi pressed on with her mission. Though she had moments of sympathy for a man whose prejudices now revealed themselves to be part of a painful family legacy, she wouldn't let the tragic backstory overshadow the harm he had done. If anything, the twist underscored how destructive and senseless racism truly was, a monster that often turned against its own. And so, as the final hearing approached, the public's interest soared. Newspapers and digital platforms dedicated endless analysis to the Brinkley family secret. Satirical cartoons depicted Brinkley confronting portraits of his black ancestors. Late-night hosts riffed on the story, highlighting the bitter irony of a racist cop who might be 1/8 or 1/4 black. But beneath the jokes, a deeper truth loomed. Racism is a lie that can poison even those with ties to the very community they attack. For Naomi, the revelation offered no real solace. Her bruised wrists and emotional scars hadn't magically disappeared. Yet, in a strange way, it gave her cause to hope. Perhaps the exposed hypocrisy would force the system to see just how ludicrous racial discrimination could be. Perhaps it would drive home the point that we are indeed more alike than different, and that the divisions created by bigotry ultimately degrade us all. The courthouse brimmed with tension on the day of Brinkley's final judgment. Swarms of reporters, activists, and community leaders gathered early, determined to witness the culmination of a case that had captured the nation's attention. Inside, the judge took her seat, solemnly reviewing her notes. Her gaze swept the courtroom before settling on Gerald Brinkley, who sat stiffly beside his counsel. Naomi Henderson was seated with her legal team on the opposite side. The hush in the room was palpable, a collective holding of breath. When the judge began her statement, her voice resonated with the authority of someone fully cognizant of the case's impact. She noted the overwhelming evidence of Brinkley's misconduct, the multiple prior complaints, and the corroborating videos from the night of Naomi's arrest. She also acknowledged the family revelations that had recently come to light, but she made clear that lineage did not mitigate wrongdoing. She found Brinkley guilty of assault and false arrest. The civil suit awarded Naomi a significant sum in damages, a portion of which she announced she would donate to civil rights organizations and youth education programs. The judge then delivered the final blow, a custodial sentence, albeit a relatively short one compared to more severe crimes, but nevertheless a stark rebuke to the decades-long pattern of impunity that some officers had enjoyed. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of reactions. Some people cheered, hugging one another as tears streamed down their faces. Others sat in stunned silence, absorbing the fact that a police officer had been convicted for racially motivated misconduct, an outcome that, in previous eras, seemed almost impossible. Brinkley himself appeared to wilt, closing his eyes as the gravity of his sentence sunk in. Naomi stayed composed, quietly dignified. In that moment, she felt no triumphant glee, only a profound sense of relief and a solemn awareness of how many others had yet to see justice. As Brinkley was led away in handcuffs, an ironic reversal of the power dynamics he once wielded, the cameras clicked and whirred, immortalizing the image for posterity. The crowd parted as he passed, some jeering, others looking on with pity. Few tears were shed for a man whose downfall had become emblematic of systemic bigotry. For Brinkley, the irony was total. A racist cop, himself with black ancestry, now a convicted criminal. Outside the courthouse, Naomi paused to address the media one last time. She commended the judge's courage in delivering a ruling that spoke to the urgency of reform. Yet, she reiterated that this verdict was just one step in a much larger journey. "I am thankful for accountability today," she said, her voice carrying through the microphones, "but real justice means transforming our institutions so that incidents like this never happen again." The crowd roared in agreement. Already social media was abuzz with reactions, praising the fairness of the ruling, dissecting the genealogical twist, and pointing to the bigger questions about systemic change. Lawmakers who had once stayed silent rushed to be associated with the momentum Naomi had sparked. Community leaders organized more events, marches, and town halls to sustain the progress. Naomi made her way to a waiting car, accompanied by her team and close friends. She caught a reflection of herself in the car's window, worn, a bit older than she felt 7 months ago, but with a renewed sense of purpose shining in her eyes. As the car pulled away, she thought of the children she hoped to help through her educational initiatives. A faint smile graced her lips. The nightmarish ordeal had, in its own way, opened doors for dialogue and activism she couldn't have conjured single-handedly. For Brinkley, karma had arrived in full force, leaving no room for doubt about the cost of hateful actions. And for Naomi Henderson, the end of the trial was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which she intended to continue shaking the foundations of injustice, armed with the belief that healing would only come through ceaseless striving for a truly equitable world.